In this video, we'll talk about associative entity. So in relational databases, the ERD is going to be converted into a series of tables eventually, where each entity type is going to be a table. Now, some relationships and attributes cannot be represented with tables. So we have some cases like multivalued attributes and many-to-many relationships that we cannot actually represent as a table. So we will need to do some kind of modification to be able to map this ERD to our database. And this modification is going to be to convert them to associative entities. So what is an associative entity? It is an entity type that associates the instances of one or more entity types and contains attributes that are specific to the relationship between those entity instances. So sometimes we need to keep track of some attributes on the relationship itself. So if we have that case, we will probably need an associative entity depending on your type of relationship, as we will see. So let's look at an example that we've seen before. So when we talk about employees completing courses, we said an employee will complete one or more courses, and a course is going to be completed by at least one employee. Now, suppose that I want to save the completion date. So I want to know for employee number one, which completed course number one, when did that employee complete that course? And when that employee completed course number two, when did that employee complete that course? So what we want to have at the end is something like this. So I need to have the employees and the courses and when did they complete them. So I want to know what each employee completed and when did that employee complete that course. Now, if we look back at what we had, we don't have anything that tells us about a date of completion. The only date I have is the birth date for the employee, which has nothing to do with the course completion date. So in this case, we will have what we call attributes on a relationship. So this will describe the features that are specific to the association between the entities in the relationship. So I will have a dotted line. Remember, it has to be a dotted line to tell me that this, in fact, is showing the attribute on this relationship, and this is not a three-way or a ternary relationship. So this is going to be an attribute. And is it an attribute of course or employee? It's not an attribute of any of them. It's an attribute of the relationship. Now, if we want to represent this in a database, we said the entities are what's going to be our table. So this is going to be a table, this is going to be a table, and I will be able to store whatever in here in this table and whatever in here in this table. But where will I store this? So I don't have a table for this yet. So I need to do some kind of modification. And that modification is going from the attribute on the relationship to an associative entity. So I called this, in this case, a certificate. So you can call this whatever name you would like to call, as long as it makes sense. And then I will include my date completed. Now, why do I have to have this? Because it's the rule of each entity to have a unique identifier. And we will see later on how we can really map those together. But now let's try to read and see if that makes sense. So we said an employee will complete multiple courses and the course will be completed by multiple employee. Now if I place certificate in the middle and I try to read it, it's gonna read like this. An employee is going to have multiple certificates, and each certificate is going to belong to one employee, and then a course is going to have multiple certificates, and each course is going to belong to, each certificate is going to belong to one course. Now, does this mean the same? If I'm looking at the date of completion, yes, it means the same, because if the employee completes multiple courses, then the employee is going to get multiple certificates, which is what I have right here. And if the course is going to be completed by multiple employees, then the course will have multiple certificates, and this is what I have right here. So the way we break it is we will have our associative entity in the middle, and then we will bring one side of the cardinality and attach it to the associative entity, and bring this side and attach it to this side of the associative entity, and then on the other side we will have ones. And to make sure, you can just read the top one and the bottom one, and if it makes sense, this means the same thing as this, then you are on the right track. So do we have other cases in which we will need associative entities? The answer is yes. So if we have the case of multi-valued attributes, now for multi-valued attributes, we cannot have them in the database as multi-valued attributes. They have to be converted to something else. So if I look at this example, when I say I have course ID with course title, and then I have multiple section numbers. So if I want to place this in the database, and I try to come here and say, okay, I have the first course as CS 3200, and the title is Database Systems, and then this section is 001. Now remember, this is the course. Now if I want to say, okay, I have another course which is CS 3200, I just say 3300 here, 3200, and then this is database, and this section is 002. Can I insert this in the same table? The answer is no, because this is my key, and this is my key again, and this has to be unique. Now what is the solution to this then? The solution is to basically divide it into or have an associative entity to save this part for me, to help me do this. So what I will have in this case, I will have a course section, and I will have, a course entity, and then I'll have course section, or section, you can call it anything. So this is going to be my entity, and this is going to be my associative entity. And what I will do is I will take this out of the entity and place it in the associative entity. And what's gonna happen is I will copy the course ID to the associative entity, which is the primary key, and I will copy the name of the multi-valued attribute as a singular attribute, and this is going to be another part of the primary key. So I'll have a composite primary key which is consisting of two attributes, and this is going to look like this. Let me just erase what I have in here so you can clearly see what I have. I think it's going to be like this, or just go back and forth through the slides, which is going to erase it. So if I look at it, it is going to be something like this. As we said, we'll divide it into two entities, the original entity and the associative entity. And then what I did is I copied course ID into the associative entity, and I moved section number, which is a multi-valued attribute, from the entity itself to the associative entity, and then both of them are going to be the primary key. Now talking about the relationship, or the constraint, or the cardinality of the relationship. Since I said the course will have multiple values for the section number, so I'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So it's going to be one to many. Now if I look here, a section number will belong to only one course. So if I have section 001, this cannot belong to another course. This can belong to either course 1 or course 2 or course 3, but it cannot belong to all of them at the same time. So the minimum is 1, the maximum is 1, so this is a mandatory many, as we have I mean a mandatory one as we have right here. Okay, so let's look at a third case in which we may need a associative entity. So as we've seen from the part and supply and vendor and warehouse, this is one case. Let's look at another case. So we have this case, sales agent, customer, and product. I did not include the cardinality constraints here just to make the thing easier to understand. And then I also have some attributes in the relationship. So what I have right here is I have customer, I have sales agent, and I have product. So what this tells me is the sales agent sells a product to a customer. And then I need to store the price and date. Now, again, if we look at this, this is an entity, so it is going to be a table. This is an entity, so it is going to be a table in my database. This is an entity, so it's going to be a table in my database. Now these two attributes, how can I save them? I don't have a table for them. The answer is using an associative entity. And how we'll do this is, again, you will break the relationship, place your associative entity in the middle, and then we place our attributes in here. And this is going to look something like this. Now let's look at one more example. So again, this is the same example that we've seen before, which is talking about certificates. But let's discuss one more thing. A many-to-many relationship can be represented as a one-to-many relationship with an associative entity in between. Now, what we discussed before is we talked about having some attributes in the relationship. But what I have right here is without any attributes in the relationship. So regardless of having attributes on the relationship, you will have to convert many-to-many relationships into an associative entity eventually. Now, the question is, which one is better? Which one is right? Is it this one or this one? The answer is both mean the same thing. Then why do we need to have this? It's going to be easier for us to model when we want to jump from ERD to what we call a relational model. When I have associative entities, it's going to be more obvious that I need to have a table right here. So it is going to be easier for me to understand and not to forget having associative entities. Now again, both of these approaches mean the same thing. So if you draw this or you draw this, you basically are doing the exact same thing. Now, one last thing I wanted to mention is for associative entities, we will have rounded corners boxes. So the boxes will have rounded corners, not like this. So if you see those corners, this means this is an entity. If we see this type of corner, this is an associative entity in this case.